What happens when a weapon this powerful gets built faster than anyone expected, and almost nobody notices? Somewhere in a secured American facility, engineers just closed out a nuclear weapons program months before the deadline, and the silence around it should worry you more than any headline could. Before you go any further, do something small but real. Tap that like button, hit subscribe, and if you know someone who thinks nuclear weapons stopped changing after the Cold War ended, send them this video. They're wrong, and by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why. Let's start with what we actually know, because stories like this one get exaggerated within hours of breaking. A new American nuclear weapon, part of a long-running family of gravity bombs that trace back to the earliest days of the Cold War, has reportedly moved through a critical stage of production faster than planned. Reports place the timeline months ahead of schedule. Not delayed, not stuck in committee. Early. In an industry where on time is often considered a win, early is almost unheard of. This news didn't dominate front pages. It slipped through quietly, buried under louder stories about missile strikes and troop deployments happening elsewhere in the world. But people who track nuclear weapons programs for a living noticed immediately, because a modern nuclear weapon finishing ahead of schedule tells you something that 1,000 press conferences never could. It tells you that a machine built to move slowly, deliberately, and cautiously has suddenly found a way to move fast. And when that machine speeds up, the whole world eventually feels it. Here's what makes this moment even harder to ignore. This isn't unfolding in a quiet, peaceful year. It's happening while American forces are actively engaged overseas, striking military targets in a live and ongoing conflict. Command posts, radar sites, weapons depots, all being hit in real time. And into that atmosphere drops the news that a next-generation nuclear weapon just crossed a major production milestone ahead of plan. Is that a coincidence? Almost certainly not in the simple sense people assume. But it's also not the dramatic story some corners of the internet are trying to sell you. The truth sits in the space between panic and indifference, and that's exactly where we're going to spend the next several minutes. So let's slow everything down. What is this weapon? Why does it exist? And what does its existence actually tell us about the next several decades of global power? Because once you understand the real answer, you'll never read a nuclear headline the same way again. First, let's remove a myth before it spreads any further, because this is the version of the story that spins wildly out of control the fastest. This development does not mean the United States is preparing to drop a nuclear weapon on anyone right now. There's no public evidence tying this specific weapon to any active target list. Nothing links it to a particular strait, a particular mountain, or a particular buried facility somewhere in a hostile country. If you've seen headlines implying otherwise, they're reaching far past what the actual facts support. And what this really represents is something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling than a single planned strike. It's a signal about how military planners think years and even decades ahead. Specifically, it's a response to a pattern playing out across multiple rival nations, burying the most valuable military assets deep underground, wrapping them in reinforced concrete, layering air defenses on top, and betting that sheer depth will protect them from almost anything short of a nuclear detonation. This new weapon exists to make that bet considerably riskier. Now here's something that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. This program didn't begin because of any single crisis. It wasn't born out of a war that hadn't even started yet. The concept was revealed publicly years earlier, described at the time as a measured long-term adjustment to a changing global security picture, not a reaction to one specific enemy. And defense officials have remained remarkably consistent on that point ever since. The decision to build this weapon came from years of quiet observation, watching rival governments pour enormous resources into digging deeper, hardening bunkers, reinforcing command centers, and investing heavily in defenses designed specifically to withstand the conventional weapons America already has in vast numbers. In other words, this weapon exists because someone else changed the rules first, and that's a pattern worth remembering because it repeats endlessly throughout military history. One side hardens its defenses, the other side eventually builds something capable of getting through them. Then the cycle starts again, quietly, for another generation. Let's also clear up some language, because getting this part wrong distorts the entire story. You'll often see this weapon casually labeled a tactical nuclear bomb online, and that description is misleading in an important way. The broader family it belongs to has included smaller tactical versions meant for closer, more limited battlefield use, and larger strategic versions meant for far more consequential missions. This particular weapon falls firmly into the strategic category. It's built for delivery by long-range strategic bombers, and it's expected to be stored domestically rather than forward-deployed overseas the way some smaller variants have been in the past. Under American nuclear doctrine, that single detail tells you almost everything you need to know. This isn't something meant to be used casually near a front line. It belongs to the small, carefully guarded category of weapons, meant to influence entire wars, entire governments, entire questions of national survival. It sits in the deterrence tier of the arsenal, not the battlefield tier. There's another term that confuses people just as often: gravity bomb. It sounds almost outdated, like something from grainy black and white newsreel footage, but it simply describes how the weapon reaches its target, released from an aircraft and falling under gravity, rather than flying under its own power the way a cruise missile does. Don't let that simple description fool you into thinking this is some crude and unguided device from another era. Modern gravity bombs, including this one, carry sophisticated guidance systems, inheriting steering technology that dramatically improves accuracy compared to the unguided bombs of decades past. And accuracy might matter here more than in almost any other weapon category in the entire arsenal. Think about it this way. A weapon that lands closer to its intended point doesn't need to rely on raw explosive size to compensate for error. It can concentrate its force precisely where planners intend, instead of spreading uncertainty across a wide, unpredictable area. That kind. Precision genuinely increases effectiveness against hardened, well-protected targets. But don't confuse precision with safety. This is still a nuclear detonation. Extreme heat, massive overpressure, radiation, possible fallout depending on conditions. None of that disappears because the guidance improved. Precision changes where the weapon lands. It does not change what the weapon fundamentally is. Now, for the number everyone eventually asks about, independent analysts who track these programs estimate the upper range of its potential yield somewhere in the hundreds of kilotons, potentially many times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. Sit with that comparison for a moment. But before your imagination runs too far ahead, understand something crucial. Governments rarely publish an exact maximum yield for weapons like this, and any precise figure circulating online should be treated as an informed estimate, not a confirmed fact. Even more important, multiplying explosive energy several times over does not mean multiplying destruction by the same amount. Terrain, altitude. A detonation, weather, and the strength of nearby structures all shape the real-world outcome in ways that never scale in a simple straight line. Still, we shouldn't undersell it either. Even accounting for all of that, a weapon in this range could devastate a large military complex and cause catastrophic damage well beyond its immediate target zone. This is a weapon that deserves neither exaggeration nor dismissal. And if you're starting to see how much nuance hides underneath every nuclear headline you've ever scrolled past, that's exactly the point of everything we're covering here. Now, let's talk about the actual science, because understanding it changes how you see this weapon completely. This isn't simply a bigger version of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. That earlier device relied purely on nuclear fission, splitting heavy atoms apart to release the energy trapped inside them. It was, in a strange way, the simpler generation of nuclear weapon design. Modern high-yield weapons like this one are generally thermonuclear, meaning they use a fission explosion purely as an initial trigger, generating the extreme heat and pressure needed to ignite a second, far more powerful stage involving nuclear fusion. Fusion is the same basic process that powers our sun, except here it's unleashed in a fraction of a second instead of unfolding gradually across billions of years. The two-stage design is exactly what allows a modern weapon to produce vastly more explosive power than the comparatively simple devices of the 1940s ever could. Now here's the question almost everyone eventually asks. Can a weapon like this actually destroy a deeply buried military facility? The honest answer: resists the simple version people want to hear. This particular weapon isn't publicly described as a dedicated earth-penetrating bunker buster. That role belongs to a related design built specifically for that purpose. But even a true earth penetrator can't simply drill hundreds of feet through solid rock the way movies suggest. Physics gets in the way almost immediately. A weapon hitting the ground at extreme speed experiences enormous structural stress. Push that speed too far, and it risks destroying itself on impact before it can function. Fail to penetrate deep enough, and much of the detonation's energy escapes upward instead of concentrating underground where it's actually needed. So does that mean a nuclear weapon is powerless against a deep underground facility? Not exactly. Even without directly reaching an inner chamber, the shock wave from a detonation can travel through surrounding rock and soil, collapsing tunnel entrances, severing ventilation and power systems, cracking support structures, and burying critical equipment under tons of rubble. In practical terms, that can functionally disable a facility, even if its innermost chamber technically survives intact. But here's the deeper truth, military planners understand better than anyone watching from the outside. The deeper and better engineered a target is, the less certain any single strike becomes, nuclear or otherwise. That's exactly why so much effort goes into studying geology, construction methods, and hidden access points long before nuclear options ever enter. Serious conversation. A nuclear weapon isn't automatically the right tool just because it's the biggest one available. Repeated conventional strikes, cyber operations, intelligence work, and special forces raids often offer alternative paths to disabling a hardened site just as effectively without the enormous political and moral weight a nuclear strike would carry. Nuclear options only become genuinely relevant when planners conclude that a target is important enough and hardened enough that nothing else in the arsenal can reliably reach it. That's precisely where this new weapon appears designed to fit. Officials have publicly described it as offering additional options against certain hardened, large-area military targets. Notice that phrase, large area. This isn't built around striking one isolated bunker. It's aimed at something broader. Sprawling installations, dispersed missile sites, hardened command complexes, places where a single high-yield detonation could functionally disable several connected elements, across a wide footprint instead of requiring separate strikes against every individual piece. Delivery matters just as much as the warhead itself. This is where things get genuinely interesting from a strategic standpoint. This weapon is expected to be carried by America's stealth bombers, aircraft purpose-built to slip through heavily defended airspace without being detected. That combination of stealth and range gives a bomber-delivered weapon something no missile can truly offer, no matter how advanced its guidance system. A bomber can be launched as a deliberate signal. It can be held on station for hours. It can be turned back before any weapon is ever released, all without irreversibly committing to an attack. That flexibility makes a nuclear-capable bomber two things at once: a physical weapon and a political message folded into a single aircraft. That dual nature sits at the center of how this entire category of weapon functions in the real world. It isn't just about destruction, it's about signaling intent, capability, and resolve without ever pulling the trigger. We're a little more than a third of the way through this story, and this is usually where most videos start losing depth. But you're still here, which already puts you ahead of most people scrolling past this topic today. If something in the last few minutes genuinely surprised you, drop a single word in the comments describing it. I read every one, and it helps this video reach people who need the full picture instead of the panic version. Now, let's talk about the pace of this program, because it genuinely stands out even against an industry not exactly known for moving quickly. The first fully completed production unit reportedly rolled out nearly a year ahead of the original internal target. Then, more recently, the agency responsible for the nuclear stockpile confirmed that every sensitive internal component scheduled for the current period had been finished months early. One of those components involves a highly sensitive internal assembly tied directly to the weapon's secondary stage, the part responsible for that dramatic thermonuclear jump in explosive power. When a component like that receives its official certification, it means it has cleared every quality and reliability requirement necessary for actual inclusion in the real stockpile. Not a test environment, the real thing. It would be easy and inaccurate to read this as evidence that the United States suddenly rushed an entire nuclear weapons program into existence purely as a reaction to the current overseas conflict. That's simply not what happened. The first production unit was already complete, well over a year before that particular campaign even began. The foundation for this program was laid long before this specific crisis started. What the recent announcement actually reflects is a scheduled milestone landing ahead of an already accelerated timeline. That still matters enormously. It's just not a panic response to a headline. Think about what it actually takes to finish something like this early. Nuclear weapons production depends on specialized materials that are difficult to source and handle safely. It depends on extraordinarily secure facilities that take years to build and certify. It depends on uncompromising quality control, because there's zero room for error in this field. It depends on a narrow, highly specialized workforce that can't simply be expanded overnight, no matter how much funding gets thrown at the problem. Finishing meaningfully ahead of schedule under those constraints is a genuine institutional achievement. It signals that the United States is successfully rebuilding a nuclear production base that had slowed considerably in the decades following the Cold War. And at the same time, it sends a fairly unmistakable message to every government watching American military capability right now, whether they're an ally or a rival. Here's something equally important that often gets lost in the excitement of a new weapon story. This program does not increase the total size of the American nuclear arsenal. The plan is to produce this weapon within the number of similar bombs already accounted for, meaning some previously scheduled production of an older design is simply being replaced by production of this newer one. The goal isn't accumulating more weapons, it's changing the mix of capability available at any given moment, trading some older, lower-yield precision weapons for a comparable number of newer, higher-yield precision weapons instead. This connects directly to something else happening quietly in the background: the gradual retirement of the largest gravity bomb still active in the American arsenal, a design several times more powerful in raw yield than even the higher estimates for this newer weapon. That older bomb has been steadily moving toward retirement for years. This new weapon doesn't fully replace that enormous raw power. What it offers instead is a more accurate, more flexible option for at least some of the missions planners worry could otherwise be left uncovered once the older weapon eventually leaves service entirely. So who actually decides when a weapon like this gets used? American nuclear policy doesn't publish a simple checklist, and that ambiguity is intentional, not an oversight. The long-standing position has been that nuclear weapons would only be considered under extreme circumstances, specifically to defend vital national interests, or those of close allies. The authority to order that use rests with the president alone. Congress doesn't vote before such an order could be issued, although the military chain of command is required to verify that any order is both authentic and lawful before it can actually be carried out. That verification step exists as a safeguard, but the decision itself is remarkably concentrated in a single office. In practical terms, using a weapon like this would rank among the most consequential decisions in modern history. It means weighing military necessity against civilian casualties, weighing fallout against battlefield outcomes, weighing the reactions of allied nations against the very real danger of a far wider regional or even global escalation. In the context of the current conflict specifically, that threshold sits especially high, for a reason worth stating plainly. The opposing nation involved does not currently possess a declared operational nuclear arsenal of its own. Using an American nuclear weapon against a state that isn't itself nuclear armed would break a taboo that has held without exception since 1945. That decision carries the potential to isolate the United States diplomatically, trigger waves of retaliation across an already volatile region, endanger American forces stationed nearby, and quite possibly push other watching nations toward pursuing nuclear weapons of their own as insurance against exactly this kind of precedent. That's precisely why the far more likely function of a weapon like this isn't battlefield use at all. It's deterrence, plain and simple. Now, here's the part of this story almost nobody's talking about, and it might be the most important piece of the entire picture. This weapon is not an isolated project. It's reportedly one of several separate warhead modernization efforts currently running in parallel across the agency, responsible for America's nuclear stockpile. And according to public reporting, every single one of those programs is currently tracking ahead of its projected schedule. Sit with that for a second, because it isn't a small detail. It might be the biggest story hiding inside this entire topic. For decades following the end of the Cold War, America's nuclear production infrastructure was widely described, including by government auditors themselves, as aging, understaffed, and in some cases barely capable of maintaining the existing stockpile, let alone developing new capability on any accelerated timeline. Facilities fell behind. Expertise thinned out as an older generation of engineers retired without enough trained replacements. The entire system slowed to a crawl for the better part of 30 years. A production enterprise finishing multiple modernization programs. Simultaneously ahead of schedule is a completely different signal than a single new weapon quietly entering service. It points toward a broader institutional recovery, one that foreign intelligence services and defense ministries around the world are almost certainly tracking just as closely as this individual weapon. Whatever happens next in the current conflict, that underlying industrial story isn't going anywhere. It's likely to keep shaping how the United States talks about deterrence, long after this particular crisis has run its course. Let's talk about deterrence properly, because it's the real engine behind everything we've covered so far. The entire purpose of a weapon like this is to manufacture uncertainty inside an adversary's mind, and that uncertainty does most of its real work long before any weapon is ever actually used. Think about it from the other side for a moment. A government pouring enormous resources into a deep underground bunker has to seriously ask itself whether that bunker is actually deep enough anymore. A commander moving critical assets underground has to ask whether those assets can genuinely survive an American strike under worst-case conditions. A nuclear-armed rival watching all of this unfold has to ask whether even its most carefully protected facilities remain meaningfully out of reach. Deterrence works partly through outright fear, but just as much it works through sustained doubt. An adversary doesn't need to know precisely how or when a weapon like this might be used. It only needs to genuinely believe the capability is real, that a credible delivery platform exists to carry it, and that a leader could plausibly authorize its use under sufficiently extreme conditions. That belief alone changes behavior. It shapes where a country decides to build its most important facilities. It shapes how deep they dig, how much they spend on concrete and steel, and how confident their military leadership feels about survival in a worst-case scenario. All of that happens without a single weapon ever leaving American soil. So step back for a moment and look at the whole picture together. A weapon. Reportedly finished ahead of schedule. A production agency hitting multiple modernization milestones early, all at once. A stockpile that isn't growing in total size, but is quietly becoming more accurate, more flexible, and more capable of reaching targets that used to feel completely untouchable. A retirement plan already underway for the largest gravity bomb America has ever fielded, and all of this unfolding in the background of an active military campaign that most of the world is only watching through the narrow lens of daily headlines about airstrikes and intercepted missiles. That's the real story here. Not one bomb, not one conflict. A quiet, methodical rebuilding of capability that's been unfolding for years, largely outside the spotlight, until a moment like this one drags it briefly into view. If this video actually changed how you think about something you'd only half understood before, that reaction is exactly why this channel exists. And it's the only reward I'm asking for. If it earned that. Subscribe if you want the next one delivered straight to you, and send it to the one person you know who still gets their nuclear news from a 30-second headline instead of the full picture. Here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. When a nation spends years quietly rebuilding its most extreme category of weapons, not to use them, but to make absolutely certain everyone believes it could, what does that tell us about the world we're actually living in right now? Not the world of daily headlines and breaking news alerts, but the deeper, slower world of decisions made years in advance. Decisions that shape how safe or unsafe every government on Earth feels about its most protected secrets. Deterrence has always worked this way, quietly, patiently, through belief rather than action. The weapon rarely needs to be fired for it to change everything. Its mere existence is often enough to reshape how the most powerful people on the planet think, plan, and calculate risk. This weapon will most likely never be dropped. Most nuclear weapons in history never are, but its existence already changes the math for every government that has ever buried its most important secrets deep underground and hoped that depth alone would be enough to keep them safe. That's the real power of a weapon like this, not what it does, what it makes other people believe it might do. And that belief, quiet, invisible, and impossible to measure precisely, may end up shaping global power far more than any single strike ever could.